From a scrappy cluster of rebellious colonies to a global superpower that reshaped the modern world, the United States is a story of relentless ambition and constant contradiction. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we're taking you through 250 years of American history. At Brooklyn Heights, General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, stared out at a forest of British masts rising from the mist over New York Bay. More than a century after his forebears first set foot in the New World, Washington, English blood, American heart, had developed very expensive tastes. He lived like a gentleman planter, wealthy in land and tobacco, but like so many founding fathers, his luxuries came wrapped in debt to the English creditors. The colonial gentry's honor and fortunes were chained to London. Its credit system, suffocating trade rules and punishing taxes, meant to fund Britain's endless wars. Rebellion was the only escape, and if it failed, the noose was waiting. There was no turning back. So when the British offered a pardon for surrender, Washington fired back. Those who have committed no faults want no pardon. Before him was the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent to foreign soil, over 32,000 troops, British regulars in redcoats, German auxiliaries known as Hessians, and the greatest navy on earth, all bearing down on 10,000 barely trained colonists. 10 ships of the line, 20 frigates, and nearly 200 transports, General William Howe's armada, filled the bay like a floating city of doom. Washington would have heard the creak of rigging and the roll of drums across the water. He told his men the time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves. We have therefore to resolve to conquer or die. But when the assault began, the British advanced with brutal efficiency. Hessian bayonets and British volleys tore through the American lines. Outflanked, outnumbered, and surrounded, the Continental forces broke. Washington watched as his men fell, fled, or were taken prisoner. The British, backed by loyalists in New York, occupied the city for 7 long years. They offered freedom to enslaved people who joined the crown. They imprisoned suspected rebels and celebrated their triumph. Meanwhile, Washington dragged his battered army into the wilderness and began plotting the impossible: overthrow an empire with a half-starved army and a divided population. A third were loyalists, a third rebels, and a third sitting on the fence. For many, it was not all about honor and liberty, but whether independence would make their life better or worse. Loyalists feared chaos, lost trade, and mob rule. Patriots saw economic opportunity with political autonomy. Neutrals, many poor or in bondage, just wanted to avoid being burned by either side. Only a decade or so earlier, rebellion would have seemed unthinkable. Yet by 1776, everything had changed. To understand why, you have to go back to England in the 1500s, a kingdom cracking under its own weight. England was crowded, unequal, and overflowing with people who had nowhere to go, and the crown, watching Spain haul shiploads of treasure from the so-called New World, wanted its own slice of that fortune. After 1588, the seas finally opened to English expansion, and their first attempt, the Roanoke colony in what's now North Carolina, simply vanished. Over 100 settlers vanished without a trace. Europeans hadn't discovered a new world at all. They had stepped into a continent already home to 7 to 10 million Native Americans. Then came Jamestown in 1607. The settlers had dreamed of gold but found mud, disease, and hunger. Within months, half were dead. But Jamestown survived not through gold, but through a leaf: tobacco. Colonist John Rolfe planted it and struck fortune. Europe's addiction to it saved the colony. Virginia expanded, but the cost was steep. Tens of thousands of poor whites shipped over as indentured servants, many of them forced. Africans survived too, first as indentured servants and later as lifelong slaves, a story we'll get to soon. Other colonies followed, each carved from blood, sweat, and tears, sometimes trading with the Native Americans but often in conflict. In Connecticut, colonists and their Indian allies massacred the Pequot, burning their fort and slaughtering hundreds. In King Philip's War in 1675, the Wampanoag struck back, killing thousands before being wiped out in turn. Disease finished what the muskets began. Waves of smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through native nations with catastrophic speed. And while disease reshaped the continent, another force was crossing the ocean: faith, in all of its fractured forms. After the Reformation splintered Europe's religious unity, many of the persecuted believers headed across the pond. And in 1620, the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower, landing in present-day Massachusetts. In 1664, the English captured New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renamed it New York after the Duke of York. What united all the new colonies was struggle. While many of the landowners on the colonies were landed gentry or wealthy merchants, usually with plenty of free labor, survival was still very difficult. Every acre had been wrested from hunger, disease, or violence. Colonists were proud of what they'd built, and by God, they would fight for it. They were under crown authority, but they had long managed their own assemblies, controlled local taxation, and governed themselves, all while Britain was preoccupied with European wars with other great powers. Over time, many colonists came to see their assemblies as legitimate as the British Parliament, but Parliament and the Crown said no. For the colonists, it seemed unfair. After all, they were British too, and now they were economically important, a major market for British goods. Britain now had much of North America and India in its pocket, but its national debt was 13.5 times its annual revenue. When King George III took the throne in 1760, the Tories, the party which believed in authoritarian rule abroad, made it brutally clear that the colonies were not Britain's equals. Then came the spark. George ordered the colonists to stop fighting native nations and to quit grabbing territory in the Appalachian Mountains. To colonists, expansion wasn't just a desire, it was a right. Being told no felt like betrayal. And then came the tax reforms. This was the moment Britain made the same mistake every empire eventually does, squeezing its colonies just a little too hard. In 1764, Parliament passed two major reforms: the Sugar Act, aimed to cut down on smuggling and raise revenue, and the Stamp Act, decreed newspapers, legal documents, diplomas, and even playing cards had to be printed on stamped paper to prove duty had been paid. That one really annoyed the colonists. They were English, not foreigners, so why were they being treated like a conquered nation? Surely it should be up to them to impose taxes. No taxation without representation, they shouted in the streets. In 1765, representatives from 9 colonies joined the Stamp Act Congress in New York City, including Benjamin Franklin. In their Declaration of Rights and Grievances they submitted to the King and Parliament, they declared that all subjects of Britain shall not be taxed without his consent. And then merchants hit Britain where it hurt. They agreed not to export any goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. In Boston, riots broke out, spreading to other colonies as men joined the resistance group known as the Sons of Liberty. Reports described British officials being dragged through the streets and covered in tar and feathers. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act, and colonists celebrated, shouting "Long live the King," and even erecting a statue of him in New York City. But the joy did not last. In June 1767, Britain passed the Townshend Acts, imposing new import duties on everyday goods like lead, glass, paint, and tea, and again going after the smugglers. These too would be repealed, but the damage was done. As planter elites marched alongside merchants, laborers, and women, their shared grievances fed a growing American political identity. 3 years later, British soldiers in Boston shot their muskets at an angry mob, resulting in a bloody massacre. And then came the breaking point. In 1773, Parliament tried to save the collapsing East India Company, drowning in debt and unsold tea. The Regulating Act put it under government control, and the Tea Act let it sell tea directly to the colonies at lower prices, undercutting local merchants. The tea was cheaper, but colonists saw a trap. Accepting it meant accepting Parliament's right to tax them. When the company's ships reached Boston Harbor, Samuel Adams and John Hancock urged the Sons of Liberty to block the landing at the risk of their lives and property. After days of a standoff, tensions snapped. On December 16, 1773, men disguised as Mohawks boarded the ships and dumped the cargo. The Boston Tea Party. It was open rebellion. Word spread across the colonies as crowds seized or destroyed tea. Britain responded by dissolving colonial assemblies and ordering troops to crack down. The colonies answered by forming the Continental Congress. Delegates were divided on what to do next. Many were loyalists, some were neutral, others, the radicals, said we want independence and nothing else. On April 9, 1775, British troops clashed with local militias in Lexington and Concord. Soon, roughly 20,000 militia, the Minutemen, surrounded Boston. At Bunker Hill, the British seized the high ground, but at a brutal cost, over 1,000 casualties, more than double the 450 suffered by the Colonials. It was a victory, but a Pyrrhic one. Massachusetts radicals, including John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock, urged Congress to send help. Moderates weren't so sure. Aiding the rebels could spark a full-scale war. In the end, they didn't send the troops, but they agreed to transform the Massachusetts militia into a Continental Army. George Washington, the Virginia delegate, was appointed as its commander. They issued the Declaration of the Causes of Necessity of Taking Up Arms to explain why this was a necessity. They insisted that they were not looking for independence, just fairness. But Britain, not exactly accommodating, responded with the Proclamation for Suppressing Rebellion and Sedition. The king declared that whatever the colonists said, this was clearly an attempt to establish an independent empire. About 20% of colonists, the Loyalists, remained devoted to the crown, but many of those would soon have to flee to Canada or England or possibly face judgment. but the British believed that they could beat the colonists from within. In Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore, declared that all indentured servants would gain their freedom if they joined the British cause, and it was a massive force of people. But the real story running underneath the revolution, the one shaping America's future, began long before the first shots of the war. The first Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619 as indentured servants, laboring beside their white counterparts until freed or dead. But Africans were more expensive to import than whites, so their numbers remained small at first. It was possible to complete a contract even by servants themselves, but most were treated brutally, making survival hard. It was hell on earth, ripped from family, dying on the ships, beaten and whipped, so some rebelled. As black and white laborers began running away, sometimes together, the colonial elite saw danger brewing. Their fear erupted into panic after Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, when whites and blacks, enslaved and free, united against Virginia's wealthy planters, including the Washington family. The revolt was ruthlessly crushed, but the ruling class was panicking. They rewrote the laws to divide those in bondage by race. African slavery became lifelong and hereditary, and the masters were granted legal immunity if an enslaved person died under their punishment, effectively making killing legal. This deliberate creation of racial hierarchy enshrined in the slave codes was designed to destroy race solidarity. The divide and rule race distinction, a turning point in American history, propagated what would become centuries of racism. So settling America was a heroic task, but it was built on the backs of forced labor. Between 350,000 and 500 white indentured servants were shipped to the Americas before and after independence, and alongside them came roughly 400,000 enslaved Africans. By the early 1760s, the enslaved population in the southern colonies had likely reached 500,000, yet they weren't asked to fight in the war because the colonial leaders feared an armed rebellion. George Washington owned both white servants and black slaves, hundreds of them over his lifetime. He even placed newspaper ads for his runaways, black and white alike. So as the revolution began, the British offering those people in bondage a path to freedom was a major concern. This wasn't about loyalty to the crown, it was pure survival. Thousands of enslaved Africans fled to British lines, while many poor whites joined loyalist militias rather than fight for patriot elites. In response, colonial governments cracked down, issuing brutal laws that threatened enslaved people with execution if they rebelled. Many were forced inland, farther from the British promise of freedom. On May 10, 1776, Congress urged all colonies to strip power from the crown and establish revolutionary governments. A few weeks later, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution that declared, "Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." A committee of 5, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, drafted the Declaration with Jefferson as the primary writer. It opened with the now famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Jefferson's original draft included a denunciation of slavery and the slave trade, but it was removed at the insistence of delegates from South Carolina and Georgia. They wanted to continue the slave trade, as well as some northern delegates who had also profited as considerable carriers of slaves. But writing down ideals was one thing, fighting the most powerful empire on earth was another thing entirely. The British struck early and hard. They drove Washington's army from New York and forced desperate retreats through New Jersey. Yet the Americans held on, aided enormously by Britain's rivals, France, Spain, and the Netherlands, who saw a chance to weaken the empire. French help proved decisive: weapons, money, troops, and most importantly, naval power. Volunteers arrived too, including Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former Prussian officer who drilled Washington's ragged troops at Valley Forge and transformed them into a disciplined force. By the late 1770s, Britain's global empire had become its weakness. Fighting stretched from North America to the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, West Africa, and India. Seeking loyalist support, the British shifted their war south, capturing Georgia and South Carolina. But there, General Nathaniel Greene used hit-and-run tactics that bled them dry. Greene pushed Lord Charles Cornwallis north into Virginia, where Washington and the French commander Rochambeau trapped him at Yorktown in 1781. With no escape by land or sea, Cornwallis surrendered. The war wasn't technically over, but Britain had lost heart. Parliament, weary of mounting costs and other global commitments, chose to end the conflict. Under the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Britain recognized the United States as independent. The colonies had won, not by raw military power, but through endurance, foreign alliances, and the overextension of the mighty British Empire. And now the serious work began. The aftermath was grim. Families were shattered. Between 30,000 and 100,000 people in bondage, black and white who had chased freedom behind the British lines, were suddenly uprooted. Many were dumped into Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or London, all while others hid inside the new United States, fighting just to stay alive. Native nations suffered horribly. The Shawnee, Creek, Cherokee, and the Six Nations of the Iroquois had largely backed Britain, hoping to halt colonists from moving west. Instead, independence opened the floodgates. Nothing stood between the new American Republic and the rest of the continent. Poor farmers, landless laborers, and veterans poured into the frontier in search of land. To them, America seemed endless. Mountains, forests, plains, and deserts. It was a universe of possibility. The 13 colonies wrote their own constitutions. The goal was to place the power in the hands of the people and prevent the tyranny they believed had characterized British rule. Pennsylvania's constitution was the most radical, granting the vote to all free men regardless of property, women excluded. Northern states began gradual emancipation. In 1780, Pennsylvania passed the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, freeing children born to enslaved mothers. And by 1783, Massachusetts had effectively ended slavery altogether through a landmark court ruling. But in most of the South, slavery hardened and rebellions were violently suppressed. Some African Americans petitioned new state governments, arguing that equality under God must include them too. Progress was slow. Thomas Jefferson, author of the immortal Born Equal line, owned more than 100 enslaved people. So did Washington, Madison, and the majority of Virginia's ruling class. The Revolution wrote liberty into the country's DNA, but there was some fine print. Winning the war was one thing. Building a functioning country afterward, that was an entirely different fight. The 13 states were independent but far from united. Their first attempt to self-govern, the Articles of Confederation, created a central authority too weak to tax, regulate trade, or raise an army. Each state acted like its own small nation, printing its own money and feuding over borders. The crisis came with Shays' Rebellion in 1786, when indebted farmers in Massachusetts rose up against taxes and foreclosures, and the federal government was powerless to stop them. To leaders like George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, it proved that liberty without order would destroy the new republic. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia intending to fix the Articles of Confederation, but instead built something entirely new: the U.S. Constitution. It created a stronger federal government with 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, and a bicameral Congress designed to balance population with state equality. The federal government could now tax, make treaties, raise armies, and enforce laws as the supreme law of the land. It also wrote slavery into law, referring to enslaved people as persons held to service or labor. To calm fears of tyranny, the Bill of Rights soon followed, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, and the press in a nation already more progressive than anywhere else on the earth. This was the future, drafted by James Madison, steeped in Enlightenment philosophy and the liberal ideals of the age. It reassured citizens that liberty would not be swallowed up by federal power. This young United States kept itself afloat with an economy built on agriculture and Atlantic trade, tobacco, rice, wheat, furs, timber, and rum, while the federal government funded itself mostly through tariffs on imported goods. The new republic needed a single executive, chosen not directly by the public but by the Electoral College. The first man selected was already a national hero, George Washington. On April 30, 1789, in New York City, wearing a plain brown suit, he took the oath of office. Some suggested he be addressed as Your Excellency, but he opted for Mr. President. Frontier poverty eventually boiled over. During Washington's presidency, farmers on the western edge of the country erupted in what became the Whiskey Rebellion. They were furious over a tax that fell the hardest on small producers who turned leftover grain into whiskey. Washington rode west with roughly 13,000 militiamen to assert federal authority. The rebellion collapsed, but it revealed that governing the new republic would be far from easy. Even so, the country was a beacon of political experimentation. The founders had hoped to avoid political parties, but factions emerged immediately. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, favored strong central government, commercial growth, a national bank, and closer ties with Britain. They were the party of the merchants, creditors, and landowners. Opposing them were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They idealized farmers and urban laborers and feared concentrated power. This ideological divide set the template for centuries of American political conflict. Indeed, in his farewell address, Washington warned that parties could help preserve liberty by checking power, but if they became too partisan, they would ignite a fire that could consume the republic. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, beginning years of bloodshed, chaos, and change that sent shockwaves around the world. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans supported it as a needed blow against a monarchical system, but the Federalists recoiled in horror. In 1796, John Adams, a Federalist, narrowly defeated Jefferson to become the second president. Under the original rules, Jefferson, as the runner-up, became the vice president. The two political enemies were forced to govern together. Alarmed by disconnected heads in France, they passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, targeting immigrants and restricting speech. Early proof that Americans' devotion to liberty had its limits. In 1800, Jefferson won the presidency. Unsurprisingly, both parties had predicted catastrophe. Federalists warned that Jefferson's election would turn America into a second blood-soaked Paris. Jefferson's allies warned that Adams and the Federalists would restore monarchy and crush liberty. The message to the public was simple: the other side will destroy everything. It was partisan hysteria, a pattern that would last, well, forever. France was now ruled by Napoleon. In 1803, Jefferson made a deal with him, buying the territory that would become known as the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of America. The land, of course, was not really France's to sell. It was home to dozens of native nations, none of whom were consulted. Their displacement would not happen all at once, but the purchase set the stage for a century of forced removals. Among those eventually uprooted were the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, who would be expelled in the 1830s under Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. Some 60,000 people were driven west at gunpoint, thousands died along the way. The Cherokee called the route the Trail Where They Cried. Today we call it ethnic cleansing. Native Americans fought back, often massacring innocent families, but the violence came back at them. Not everyone agreed with the Removal Act. Congressman Davy Crockett, the famous frontiersman, broke with President Jackson and condemned the policy as wicked and unjust. His vote cost him his seat in Congress. Slavery in this period was still going strong. Some native nations owned African slaves themselves, and some practiced forms of bondage long before Europeans arrived. Native peoples were also enslaved by the Europeans in large numbers during the 1600s and early 1700s, especially in the Carolinas. Meanwhile, in the North, states were gradually phasing out slavery. New Jersey was the last to adopt gradual emancipation, and gradual meant decades of coerced labor. Children born to enslaved mothers had to serve as indentured servants until their mid-20s. In New York City, 1 in 5 white families owned enslaved people in the late 1700s. Between 1783 and 1800, fewer than 80 enslavers freed anyone voluntarily. Even by 1830, 3,500 people remained enslaved in the North, far more than most Americans today realize. In 1812, with James Madison in the White House, the United States, urged on by congressional war hawks, declared war on Britain and invaded Canada. They hoped to seize territory and break British influence among native tribes. In short, it didn't go well. In 1814, British troops counterattacked, capturing Washington, D.C. and burning the Capitol and the presidential mansion. First Lady Dolly Madison famously saved a portrait of Washington before fleeing to safety. Federalists denounced what they called Mr. Madison's War, and discontent in New England grew so fierce that some states talked openly of secession. But Britain, busy defeating Napoleon in Europe, soon wanted peace. The Treaty of Ghent in 1814 restored the borders to what they had been before the war. The conflict might have ended quietly, but the news traveled slowly. 2 weeks after the treaty, General Andrew Jackson won a stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, crushing a major British assault and turning him into a national hero. But in global terms, the United States was still a minor player compared to Britain. Even so, prosperity was spreading. More farmers were turning profits, and in the North, factories and mills were transforming the economy. A new middle class emerged, leading to the slowdown of indentured labor. But industrial growth came with a price. The booming textile mills of the North relied on southern cotton, picked by slaves on vast plantations. As railroads, canals, and cities spread across the landscape, inequality deepened. The market revolution had given birth to a powerful new nation, driven by invention and ambition. Yet its success still largely rested on exploitation. Enslaved people were growing restless, their lives miserable, their bodies viewed as expendable products. Meanwhile, poor whites were pushed into child labor, mill work, and dangerous factory jobs. Industrial America exploded in size, and with it came booms, busts, and chaos. But while industry surged and many enjoyed the payoff of all their hard work, the problem of slavery didn't go away. It was the nation's Achilles heel, a moral wound, but still powering an economic engine. Southern plantations were pumping out vast quantities of cotton, shipped through northern ports and sold to Britain and the U.S.'s textile mills. Slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was a major contributor to the entire American economy. And this is where America's biggest contradiction became impossible to hide. Across the ocean, the British Empire had moved in the opposite direction. In 1807, Parliament had banned the slave trade, and in 1833 it had abolished slavery throughout its empire. The Royal Navy spent decades and a fortune hunting illegal slave ships. The U.S., however, held on, but now in an environment of doubt and criticism. Former slave Frederick Douglass emerged as one of the most powerful voices against bondage, telling the nation what slavery actually felt like: terror, horror, humiliation, and pain. As a young runaway, he had learned to read with the help of the poor white urchins who shared scraps of newspapers, an education that changed American history. His writings shocked the public, but not all abolitionists were so peaceful. Some, like John Brown, turned to violence. His 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry, intended to spark a slave uprising, failed. Brown was captured and executed, but he became a martyr for anti-slavery in America. Even Congress could be violent. Senator Charles Sumner was nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor after condemning the slaveholding South. He too became a symbol of resistance. The political divide hardened. Democrats, dominated by Southern planters and Northern allies, defended slavery's expansion to the West. The new Republican Party gathered abolitionists, reformers, and opponents of Southern power. When Abraham Lincoln ran for president in 1860, he viewed slavery as immoral but understood the danger of too rapid a change. The country was now divided beyond repair. When Lincoln was elected, Southern leaders saw it as the end of their political power. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy raised an army but exempted the wealthy and the well-connected, anyone who owned more than 20 enslaved people, along with teachers, politicians, ministers, clerks, and men in essential trades. Poor white Southerners with few means of escape were drafted in the droves, sometimes serving as paid substitutes for people who had money. 20 to 25% of Southern households had at least one slave, but the poor had none. Many of them bitterly called it a rich man's war but a poor man's fight. Enslaved people weren't enlisted, but many were forced to support the Confederate war effort, building fortifications, hauling supplies, and tending crops, while thousands more escaped to join or assist the Union Army. Like all wars, propaganda motivated men to fight. Southerners decreed Northerners and the fact that slums had grown with industry where poor whites lived in horrid conditions. But to Union generals Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, this war wasn't just about liberating slaves. They thought that they could get poor Southern whites on board. The South was home to about 3/5 of the wealthiest individuals in the U.S., but inequality was devastating. Grant promised to remove the shackles of the poor white class, millions of people, while liberating the blacks. The war was a bloodbath, the deadliest conflict in American history, lasting from 1861 to 1865. The Union finally broke the Confederacy's last resistance, and on April 9, 1865, exhausted, surrounded, and out of options, the Southern forces surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. As Washington erupted in celebration, crowds drank, danced, and sang beneath the clouds of fireworks. Just 5 days later, President Lincoln went to Ford's Theater to watch the comedy Our American Cousin. As he sat beside his wife in the theater box, John Wilkes Booth slipped in behind him. Wilkes Booth fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head before leaping to the stage and shouting "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Booth, a passionate Confederate sympathizer, believed Lincoln was a tyrant who had destroyed Southern liberty and empowered Black Americans. He'd suspended habeas corpus too. Wartime actions, Booth said, were proof of dictatorship. In his mind, the murder was an act of patriotic redemption that would put things right. Instead, his bullet plunged the nation into chaos. Booth had thought his actions would be supported, but few agreed with what he had done. Lincoln, who had been planning a relatively lenient Reconstruction to reunite North and South, was dead, and with him perhaps the best hope for a peaceful healing. At the same hour that Booth had fired his shot, his co-conspirator Lewis Powell forced his way into Secretary of State William H. Seward's home and slashed him repeatedly. Seward survived, Powell would not. He was later tortured and hanged with the other conspirators. Booth was tracked down and killed in a shootout. From the beginning, Americans had whispered conspiracy theories about who was really behind Lincoln's assassination, a habit that the nation would embrace for many years to come. America was stunned, bloodied, and polarized, teetering on the edge of more violence. Yet, even through the madness, it remained a nation of restless energy, progress, and industry, hurtling into the modern age. But as Reconstruction came, so did resentment. Southern elites began fanning hostility between the races. In this twisted logic, freed Black people were often portrayed as salvageable, while poor whites were seen as dangerous dead weight. However, for all of America's violence and inequality, it still allowed for more social mobility than most of Europe's old stratified societies. And there was a boom on the horizon. Lincoln's Homestead Act had offered Western land for free to settlers who farmed it. while factories were about to push the USA into an age of growth. Hundreds of thousands of people used the Homestead Act to claim land. Immigrants poured in from abroad, while Native Americans were pushed onto reservations, their bison slaughtered and communities shattered. As railroads and ranches consumed the frontier, millions of acres of native land were seized. Vice President Andrew Johnson became the president. A Southerner from Tennessee who had stayed loyal to the Union, he disliked the planter elite, but he opposed equal rights for freed Black Americans. Under his lenient presidential Reconstruction, former Confederate leaders were pardoned and quickly returned to power. Southern legislatures passed the Black Codes, laws designed to control nearly every aspect of Black life and force freed people into conditions barely removed from slavery. These codes restricted where Black Americans could live and work, imposed curfews and vagrancy laws, and they allowed authorities to arrest unemployed Black people and hire out their labor. If poor whites were angry about rising competition for jobs, Black Americans faced something much worse: the birth of the Jim Crow system. Through segregation, disenfranchisement, and violent terror, Southern states built a radical caste system that lasted until 1965. Lynchings became a tool of terror. Being in the wrong town without permission could get a Black person beaten, jailed, or even murdered. Entire communities lived under constant threat. Freedom had been won on paper, but it was way off in practice. Still, Congress, led by the radical Republicans, rebelled against what they saw as President Johnson's leniency toward the Confederates. Congress overrode his vetoes, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and approved the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection to anyone born in the United States. Johnson refused to enforce them, and in 1868 became the first president ever impeached. So although Johnson inherited a nation that had abolished slavery, his actions delayed genuine freedom for millions of newly freed people. White supremacy spread across the South like wildfire. Meanwhile, whites were told by Southern elites that they were superior by virtue of the color of their skin. It gave impoverished whites the illusion of status while keeping them nearly as poor as before, and it kept both races from uniting for better pay. Frederick Douglass put it bluntly: they divided both to conquer each. Hundreds of thousands of freed Black Americans soon worked in factories, shipyards, quarries, and on railroads. By 1870, the Black population had reached roughly 4 million, more than a tenth of the entire country. James Garfield, who had grown up poor, was a supporter of civil rights when he became president in 1881. He wasn't in office for long, though. Like Lincoln, he was assassinated, this time by an assassin with delusions of grandeur. They were violent times, but the U.S. was entering an astonishing age of industrial growth. The country was making good on its promises, a beacon of liberal ideals symbolized in the Statue of Liberty, a gift from the French after ending slavery. The Gilded Age was in full swing. Industrialists accumulated staggering fortunes. Like Europe, America had slums, but many Americans still believed that they could climb the ladder, and they could compared to the underclass in most other nations. America had gone from subsistence settlements and scattered frontier hunters to a continental economy close to rivaling the world's richest civilizations. By the early 20th century, it was a powerhouse. Men amassed fortunes: John D. Rockefeller in oil, Andrew Carnegie in steel, Cornelius Vanderbilt in shipping and railroads, and J.P. Morgan in finance. With that wealth came a flourishing of free thought and dissent. It was a time where individuals could reshape the world through effort and innovation. That philosophy defined the American spirit of creativity. This was a world where anything was possible, where buildings would soon reach the sky. Many Americans believed their country was the future of humanity, a manifest destiny, America's divine right to expand. U.S. leaders had often insisted they were not building an empire, but that wasn't entirely true. Indigenous peoples had already been pushed off their lands. Mexico had been forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, surrendering half of its territory. Modern California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Hundreds of thousands scrambled to the west during the gold rush, flooding into the boomtowns of boarding houses, brothels, saloons, and makeshift camps. Crime flourished. Sheriffs and marshals struggled to impose order on what was quickly becoming the Wild West. Nearly 200,000 Chinese migrants arrived, mostly heading west to mine, build railroads, or open small businesses. It was manifest destiny in action, often violent and deeply corrupt, yet always wrapped up in the language of freedom, opportunity, and national unity. This West became the core of American mythology. The stories of cowboys, Indians, Billy the Kid, and Buffalo Bill were loosely based on real figures but wrapped up in fantasy. They often left out the harsh realities for many of the poor on the frontier. Still, this was the birth of the American outlaw hero, a character that is still admired today. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the country began acting like a true empire. After defeating Spain in 1898, the U.S. seized Guam and Puerto Rico. In the Philippines, they promised civilization and liberty, while crushing the Filipino independence movement in a brutal counterinsurgency that killed hundreds of thousands. In Central America and the Caribbean, the U.S. invoked the Monroe Doctrine, that the Americas were under U.S. protection and influence. It sent Marines to Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic and backed dictators favorable to American corporations. The reality, as always, was far more complicated. Smedley Butler, a major general who became the U.S.'s most decorated soldier, pulled the veil back and kicked off what would become decades of foreign policy skepticism. At the end of his distinguished career, he lamented that he'd been an attack dog for imperialists. He was even a part of a plot that never got off the ground by big business leaders to overthrow President Roosevelt, an early reminder of the power that corporations would come to have in the USA. World War I was the US's coming-out party on the stage of major global warfare. It entered the war in 1917, tipping the balance against Germany and proving itself a global heavyweight. When the guns fell silent in 1918, America was no longer just a distant observer. It was a creditor to Europe, having showcased its exceptional industrial capacity. Over 116,000 Americans died and more than 200,000 were wounded, but the real victory wasn't military, it was economic and geopolitical. The old empires were broke, the US held the purse strings, it wouldn't need colonies to control the world. Dollars, diplomacy, and covert influence would do the job just fine. The 1920s were a golden era, at least on the surface. Corporations flourished even more, cities grew at dizzying speed as the buildings grew taller. People danced through the nights to jazz, a revolutionary art form born from African-American creativity alongside the blues. This was the age of electricity, when power grids spread across the nation and new mass industries transformed daily life. The country had come alive with the inventions previously shown off at the world fairs, putting the U.S. firmly in the driving seat of the future. Thanks to Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, advertising shifted from describing what products did to selling how they made you subconsciously feel. It was the century of self, and that suited individualist America right down to the ground. A growing middle class embraced this new culture, but millions of workers remained trapped in poverty, fueling labor activism and a rising interest in socialist and communist ideas. It was these ideas that would soon set the world on fire when they bumped headfirst into fascism. Then came the fall. Rampant speculation, much of it fueled by easy credit, margin loans, and lightly regulated banks, triggered the catastrophic crash of 1929. When 16 million shares were dumped in a single day, Wall Street collapsed. Thousands of banks failed, wiping out life savings overnight. The Great Depression that followed left roughly a quarter of Americans unemployed. And in some industrial cities, unemployment soared to 40 to 50%. Shantytowns, known as Hoovervilles, spread across the country like open sores that exposed sickness within. For many, the optimism of the early 20th century dissolved into crime, hardship, and disillusionment with capitalism. Prohibition from 1920 to 1933 intended to improve morality and reduce violence, but it did the exact opposite. Drinking initially dipped, but a vast black market emerged. Poor moonshiners, Irish and Italian immigrant gangs, and syndicates led by mafia figures turned bootlegging into a multi-million-dollar industry. At the same time, narcotics spread through poorer communities. Opium had been widespread ever since the hundreds of thousands of injured and traumatized Civil War veterans became addicted. But now morphine and later heroin were making appearances. The war against drugs created a monster because the profits were all too alluring and the demand too wide. In the decades that followed, U.S. foreign policy only made the problem worse. Intelligence agencies at times tolerated or directly enabled allied regimes whose trafficking networks flooded American cities with heroin and later cocaine. Drugs had become a major chapter in the American story, and it seemed on every page things just got worse. The glittering 1920s had promised a paradise of pleasure, technology, and freedom, but when that dream collapsed, extremism rushed into the vacuum of lost hope. In a broken post-war Germany, Adolf Hitler rose from fringe radical to national leader. He blamed Germany's humiliation on international finance, taking aim at the Jews, and promised revival through racial purity and authoritarian rule. His relationship with the U.S. was complicated. He called it a mongrel nation with degenerate music, but there was much he liked too. He praised Henry Ford in Mein Kampf for his anti-Semitic writings. Ford, who did a lot of business with the Nazis, accepted a medal from the Nazi regime in 1938. Hitler also drew inspiration from American eugenics. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, prominent U.S. scientists and progressive politicians promoted sterilization of people labeled as feeble-minded, defective, criminal, promiscuous, and parasites. They claimed poor whites along with minorities, mostly blacks and indigenous people, were holding America back. 32 states passed sterilization laws, and the Rockefeller Foundation funded early German eugenics research. By 1939, as Hitler invaded Poland, the U.S. wanted nothing to do with Europe's wars. A Gallup poll showed just 8% favored sending U.S. troops overseas. World War I was seen as a catastrophic mistake. Isolationism ruled, as Roosevelt publicly criticized European colonial powers. But events forced a change. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and public opinion flipped almost overnight. Over 407,000 Americans died during the war, with 671,000 wounded. In Europe, the scale of bloodshed was catastrophic. On the Eastern Front alone, roughly 27 million Soviet citizens were killed, soldiers, civilians, and at least 7 to 9 million children. Germany lost more than 4 million. Cities starved, armies froze, atrocities were constant, and that is where Hitler ultimately lost the war. The US played a decisive role. It supplied Britain and the USSR with weapons, food, tanks, and trucks on a massive scale. American industry roared back to life, ending the Depression, but wartime prosperity also deepened inequality. Over 6 million American workers had participated in strikes over wages and conditions. It fueled post-war fears that the public and politicians might start embracing socialism or worse, communism. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin carved up the post-war world, and a new storm was already forming. Soviet troops dominated Eastern Europe. American planners feared that communism would spread. The Americans, with scientists from all over the world working on their Manhattan Project, had tested an atomic bomb. It changed humanity overnight. It highlighted American strength, but it also opened a new chapter in world history. Before his death, Roosevelt had become an American hero to millions. His New Deal had pulled the country out of its deepest crisis and gave ordinary Americans a sense that the government was on their side. His critics, especially business elites, warned of creeping socialism. The era was politically explosive, with left-wing populists arguing Roosevelt hadn't gone far enough. Men of the people like Henry Wallace and Huey Long pushed far more radical ideas: universal healthcare, stronger social programs, and a major redistribution of wealth. Wallace was pushed aside in what some called a bloodless coup, and Long was assassinated. One thing that you could say about the USA was, it was never boring, and it was about to get crazy. Roosevelt had believed the post-war world could be built on cooperation between the great powers, including Stalin's Soviet Union. Churchill, though, came out of the war far more suspicious. Britain had bled itself dry fighting Hitler, and Churchill feared that the Red Army, now occupying Eastern Europe, would dominate the continent. Both he and the American planners were already thinking about how to destroy Russia with nukes, well, once they were made. When Truman took office, he aligned more closely with Churchill's view. He was blunt, anti-communist, and convinced that Stalin's brutal regime would expand its influence wherever it could. Intelligence reports soon deepened his fears. In 1949, U.S. analysts detected radioactive contamination drifting over the Pacific. Truman announced the cause: the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb. The monopoly America had enjoyed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki was gone. The arms race began in what would become an action-packed 20th century. In 1950, North Korea, backed by Stalin and later China, invaded the South. Americans were exhausted from World War II, but policymakers feared that if South Korea fell, Japan and Southeast Asia might follow. The war was catastrophic. Millions of Koreans died, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were killed, and over 36,000 Americans died. It ended not in a victory but in a 1953 armistice that still holds today. Truman called it a police action, a kind of euphemism future administrations would use to wage limited war without officially declaring one. The USSR would later follow suit. But at home, far from the nightmare of Korea, the US was entering an era of dazzling prosperity and cultural dominance. Hollywood films spread American imagery to every corner of the globe. Jazz, rock and roll, and the beat writers shaped global culture. Home ownership soared. By 1960, over 60% of Americans owned a home, and car ownership became nearly universal. Suburbs exploded across the map. The white picket fence became the national symbol. The car symbolized freedom, as immortalized in Jack Kerouac's novel On the Road. This was America, endless, beautiful, wild, and brutal. But beneath the optimism, cracks were still there. As Black Americans fled Jim Crow for northern and western cities, they encountered new forms of discrimination. Neighborhoods were divided by red lines on the maps, areas where banks refused loans, insurance companies denied coverage, and investors stayed away. Crime rose in those underfunded, segregated places, some later home to mass riots. Some economists, like Thomas Sowell, later argued that the picture was more complicated, but redlining and discriminatory policing undeniably deepened hostility. America was wealthy, confident, and culturally vibrant, but it was also fractured, evident in the civil rights structures of the 1960s. At that same time, the Cold War brought fear, secrecy, and paranoia. Founded in 1947, the CIA overthrew governments in Iran and Guatemala to protect American economic interests and contain the Soviet Union, along with leftist and democratic independence movements. Some would later call this a stunning hypocrisy. At home, anti-communist hysteria had been present since the war. Politicians were smeared as commies and even homosexuals. The FBI and CIA compiled secret files on thousands of citizens. Journalists chipped away at the secrecy, exposing CIA activities despite the agency trying to suppress them. Skepticism grew. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general, gave a stunning warning in his farewell address on January 17, 1961. The rise of a military-industrial complex that could distort democracy. 3 days later, John F. Kennedy took office. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Some called it the day America lost its innocence. In the aftermath, America plunged into an era of doubt and conspiracy. Lawyers, journalists, and former intelligence officers spent decades arguing that Kennedy's enemies, foreign or domestic, may have played a role in his death. The House Select Committee on Assassination years later would indeed say JFK was, quote, probably assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. The nation felt haunted, and that nightmare got worse as Malcolm X in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and Robert F. Kennedy in 1968 were also assassinated. Each killing spawned theories that the violence was not random, but symmetric. It felt like the party was over. And yet, the late 1960s were also an explosion of hope and cultural brilliance. Psychedelics seeped into youth culture. The hippie movement embraced long hair, free love, and a rejection of authority. Harvard hippie Timothy Leary urged people to turn on, tune in, and drop out. The 50s were well and truly buried. Civil rights made historic gains. Women's rights advanced. The Woodstock Music Festival in 1969 symbolized the beauty of an era. Altamont, later that same year, symbolized its collapse when a young man was stabbed by the Hells Angels just after the Rolling Stones had sung Sympathy for the Devil. As the writer Hunter S. Thompson later said, the wave had broken and rolled back. Meanwhile, the Vietnam War tore the country apart. Americans had been told the war was necessary to stop communism, but photos and film of napalm, massacres, and burned villages told a different story. Protests surged. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and ordinary citizens alike, using wiretaps, smears, and illegal surveillance. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black families in the South. Far-left militants bombed government buildings. And if things couldn't get any worse, journalists blew the lid off of the secrets of the CIA. Maybe most shocking of all was MKUltra, one of the CIA's mind control programs that together lasted over 30 years. Thousands of Americans in prisons and hospitals had been tested on, their minds blitzed with LSD in an effort to see if they could extract information or create an assassin, a Manchurian candidate. The US government looked like science fiction. And by 1975, Vietnam was united under a communist government. 2 to 3 million Asians dead, and around 58,000 Americans who didn't come home, all for a war that ended in a complete failure. After the Watergate scandal, President Richard Nixon had resigned, and President Gerald Ford tried to reassure the country, our long national nightmare is over. The 1970s felt chaotic in other ways. Inflation surged into double digits, working-class wages stagnated, crime rose, cities such as New York hovered near bankruptcy and looked like violent anarchy. Many Americans turned toward conservatism, craving order. Hollywood reflected the mood with tough cop heroes like Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry, or regular guys who had to take the law into their own hands. Deindustrialization tore through the country. Detroit's manufacturing workforce fell from 338,000 to around 153,000 over 3 decades. The entire Rust Belt felt the shock. Globalization, automation, and foreign competition accelerated the decline. By the time the 80s arrived, America was desperate for a new story, and the new president offered one. In 1981, Ronald Reagan promised optimism, lower taxes, deregulation, and a revived sense of national pride. His policies, known as Reaganomics, cut taxes, especially at the top, and reduced regulations on finance and industry. Supporters credit him with ending the inflation crisis, restoring America's confidence, and helping pressure the Soviet Union toward collapse. The economy boomed, millions of jobs were created, and homeownership expanded. But critics point out the costs. The national debt tripled, unions were weakened, homelessness rose, and inequality widened. The rich and the middle class gained, but the blue-collar workers continued to struggle. By the late 1980s, the top fifth of households enjoyed rising incomes, while the bottom half stagnated or declined. The decade was also shaped by two major crises. AIDS swept through major cities as disco music and cocaine energized nightlife. More than 20,000 Americans died before the government fully mobilized. Then came the Iran-Contra affair. Senior U.S. officials secretly sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Investigative journalism then showed that the CIA had at least turned a blind eye to Contra cocaine trafficking that caused a crack epidemic, mostly in black ghettos. The philosophy of neoliberalism promised wealth would trickle down, but critics argued it didn't trickle enough. The Cold War ended in 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Americans could breathe easy after decades of fearing mutually assured destruction. Russia imploded, and the corrupt rich took off with the country's money. Meanwhile, China's chairman, Deng Xiaoping, turned his country into an economic miracle, thanks largely to U.S. consumerism. America looked invincible. It was the world's only superpower. But would this unipolar moment last forever? When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, Congress authorized President George H.W. Bush to intervene, setting precedents that would later shape the War on Terror, a two-decade conflict that would cost the American taxpayers at least $8 trillion and usher in an era of mass surveillance. But for many, the 1990s were a brighter time. Electronic music, grunge, and rap replaced the sugary pop of the 80s. Tech companies like Microsoft, Apple, and later Google transformed daily life. The rise of the internet changed humanity as profoundly as the printing press had. But beneath the surface, cracks widened. Crack cocaine still devastated black neighborhoods. Meth and heroin gripped poorer white communities. President Clinton signed harsh drug and crime bills that accelerated mass incarceration. Free trade policies like NAFTA were supposed to create stable jobs in Mexico. Instead, millions migrated north, legally and illegally seeking a better life as U.S. blue-collar wages floundered. Between 1990 and 2010, the foreign-born share of the U.S. population rose from 7.9% to 12.9%, and the number of undocumented immigrants climbed from 3.5 million to over 11 million. And it would climb much higher a decade later. The decade ended with the dot-com boom and bust, and then everything changed again. And the shock that came next would rewrite the entire 21st century. Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers, and President George W. Bush promised to make things right. This led to one of America's most controversial wars, Iraq Part II. It was justified by faulty intelligence, claims that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and ties to 9/11. Both were false. Still, the invasion went forward, killing at least 200,000 to 300,000 Iraqi civilians or more, and over 4,500 U.S. troops and contractors. Over 1 million people were displaced. As the country collapsed into chaos and insurgents like ISIS emerged from the ruins, public skepticism grew. Americans were told it was about freedom and security, but to many it looked like something else, a blueprint for U.S. dominance across the Middle East. The Afghanistan War was launched in 2001 to destroy al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban. It would last 20 years, the longest in U.S. history. Debates raged. Did these wars benefit the world? Were they strategically successful? Did they benefit the American public? As the U.S. elected its first black president, Barack Obama, in 2008, and again in 2012, activism moved online. For many, Obama symbolized renewal after years of war. For others, his presidency ended in frustration. His grand ambitions, many said, had been constrained by entrenched interests in what many were now calling the deep state. Polls showed that trust in government, whether left or right, was at an all-time low. In 2008, the financial crash plunged the world into a recession. 8.7 million jobs were lost in the U.S. over the next 2 years, and there were 10 million home foreclosures. But many of the very wealthy saw their net worths increase. One of the major criticisms of the late 20th century was the power of lobbyists and campaign donations, which critics said were weakening democracy and hurting the people. Mistrust of political elites and the media set the stage for Donald Trump, the real estate magnate and television celebrity. He promised to make America great again, vowing to rebuild industry and curb immigration. To many working-class voters, it was the first time in years someone had spoken directly to their anger. He won the 2016 election, stunning the establishment. Polarization intensified as journalism became a partisan battleground. Identity politics inflamed division, driven by algorithms rewarding outrage over nuance. Trump pledged to end the American carnage, but his blunt populism and combative style deepened the national divide as Joe Biden then became president. This had come with another shock, the COVID-19 pandemic, whose lockdowns triggered the largest transfer of wealth in modern history from the poor to the rich. In the years that followed, science fiction became reality with AI, but with that came job insecurity. The cost of living increased, wages stayed stagnant, birth rates fell, arguments over mass immigration exploded, addictive technologies caused brain rot in line with the first average IQ drop in the US since records began. And by the mid-2020s, global peace looked very fragile, with wars in Ukraine and the Middle East and the US-China rivalry intensifying. In that American cynicism, people's deep distrust of establishment politics they'd had now for so long went into overdrive because of a man named Jeffrey Epstein. The US was still on top of the world, life was good for so many people, so much easier than times in the past, but polls showed faith in the system was as low as it had ever been in modern history. So after 250 years of upheaval, ambition, crisis, and reinvention, what does America look like today? New generations were born into a world nothing like their parents, a world of constant connection, yet deep disconnection, growing wealth gaps, and rising social anxiety. Older Americans lamented the loss of simpler times, but the truth is times were never simple. The past was never perfect, and the future won't be either. But Americans still chase what the founders promised: fairness, freedom, and a share in the spoils, leaders who serve the public good, and hope, the most American thing of all. Now, go watch USA Today if the South won the Civil War to see the alternate America that could have existed, or click on this video instead.